Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Forge for the videos for week 5 of the fantasy football season. And we're on the tight ends today. I've gotten some food in me, so we're ready to keep going with this show. If you have not noticed, wide receiver and running back videos were released earlier on in the day, so go and check those out. They will look a little bit different than this because I have done the projections for the tight ends and the quarterbacks. They're a little bit quicker to do than the wide receivers and running backs. The projections are over on the left, and then my rankings will be on the right. As I have said in the past, as far as especially my wide receivers and tight ends rankings are rather aggressive, and I'm pretty darn sure that is due to an emphasis on tight end or a touchdown possibility slash taking advantage of touchdown possibility being incorporated in the actual number that ends up ranking them. That's the part that's aggressive. These parts are fine. So I kind of like that for tight end because tight end is so touchdown dependent. But of course, especially early on in the season with how few sample sizes there are, things can get skewed a decent amount based on the previous amount of touchdowns that have players have gotten. And so for the wide receivers, I might tone that down a little bit this week in that number. But right here for the projections over on the left, this is my temperature gauge, just basically a measure of the matchup. If a certain amalgamation of factors are working in favor for these players to have bigger weeks, or maybe in the case of the cold here, the blue, not in favor of a big week, actually to the opposite, in favor of a poor week. So that is how that works. And then expected floors and ceilings and an expected range right here. I think that's all fairly self-explanatory. Just a quick look at the projections before we move over to the rankings, where I'll point some things out. Will Dissly got fairly high up here. Once again, I do believe that is in large part just due to what I just spoke about touchdowns and how much of an weight that has on these ranking and the projected rankings over here. Other than that, you can take a moment and just notice some of the good matchups versus the more poor matchups, if you would like. And all of this can be found up on the website at www.theFFforge.com. And the rankings portion over here will get updated at some points before Sunday, or at the very latest on Sunday, but also just throughout the week, as especially for major bits of news as they come out. One player that in my rankings would definitely take a dive, Gerald Everett, if Keenan Allen comes back, and especially if it's not like a game time decision and we know already on Friday that he'll be playing this week, then I would probably drop Gerald Everett down to like 11 and push all of these gentlemen up, just because that is such a big boost to the amount of targets that Gerald Everett's going to see, at least in a small sample size so far this season. But I do expect that to be fairly true, although Gerald Everett was a tight end that I was fairly high on coming into the season, just based on the amount of usage that Justin Herbert had for the how much he used tight ends last season. Other than that, I did so Hunter Henry, I did not update anything as far as the expected usage for him, with Jonnu Smith most likely being out this week, just because his numbers are already quite high. He is on the field, I think it was around 85% of snaps, and he had a similarly maybe high 70 percentages for the amount of routes run. That could increase a little bit, and he is higher up in my rankings, but I did not update any of his numbers for the projections. But I did update Cade Otton's. I updated Cade Otton's numbers, so that they would be somewhere about halfway between where Cameron Brate's and his normal numbers have been. Just to let you know, I did do that for Cade Otton. Expected him to be a little bit higher up here, but 'twas not the case. Other than that, let's get on over to the rankings, where I have my top 12 is Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Dallas Goedert, Pat Freiermuth, TJ Hawkinson, Tyler Higbee, Gerald Everett, and then Kyle Pitts, David Njoku, Darren Waller, George Kittle, Zach Ertz. I already explained Gerald Everett is contingent upon Keenan Allen's return as far as how high up he is. Now, as far as Kyle Pitts goes, if you go over here and you look at the rankings, he still has a quite high ceiling and an okay floor there. So, and then a decent expected range as well. So just as far as the numbers go, I was a little bit surprised at how high his snap percentage and route percentage were. Now, of course, those do come in limited numbers in that offense. There aren't as many snaps or as many routes run as there are on most offenses around the league. All the numbers are there, just like I said about TJ Hawkinson 2 weeks ago. And then, of course, the first week he defined in fantasy, but that prediction wasn't looking super promising as his usage actually went down, or at least his number of balls caught. I think it was down to like 3 for like 15 yards and a touchdown or something. But, of course, then that did come true this last week in explosive ways, and that's possible for Kyle Pitts. Now, 35 points or something around that number, probably not likely, but all of the advanced metrics are still there for Kyle Pitts, and that ceiling is still there. So I'm still buying Kyle Pitts. However, it's very possible, if you are a Kyle Pitts owner, that you would have a Gerald Everett or a Tyler Higbee, in which case I do have them ranked higher, so go right ahead and sit Kyle Pitts in that instance. I believe that the next person that we would have some level of concern here would be George Kittle. And once again, looking at his numbers, they weren't as bad as I expected them to be, and George Kittle has never been the highest route running tight end. He's always been a highly productive, like an Alvin Kamara type for the running back position, where it's like some of those advanced metrics aren't really working in his favor for the amount of production that he's put up. And that's really been a true-ish thing for George Kittle. Maybe, it's even worse this year so far in his return, but he has such a high upside that I'm still not looking to sit George Kittle. And I still believe in him just fine, and I think he's better off with the new quarterback in there compared to Trey Lance. So not too concerned about George Kittle. He hasn't aged that much in these past years. Maybe he's still getting back into things as far as getting up to his actual speed. And so maybe they've just, in part, that's part of the reason why they've not game planned for him as much. But definitely included him in my top 12 here. And Zach Ertz, there is some concern this week going up against Philadelphia. That is a tough team to play, and I'm definitely concerned about that Arizona offense this week. If you were to feel the same and you have, I'd say, one of these 4 guys behind him, I would not tell you not to start them over Zach Ertz this week if you felt more comfortable with that. Tyler Conklin did end up falling back a little bit in my rankings. We had to get Kyle Pitts up in here. We had to get George Kittle up in there. And I still like Darren Waller a little bit more. As you can see, he actually had a higher floor than Tyler Conklin yet. So took advantage of that. And this is how it ended up. But there is also a little bit of concern I talked about on the waiver wire that Tyler Conklin only had 5 targets last week. Part of what his rise to being awesome has been the amount of targets that he's gotten. Now, he did produce on those 5 targets, so that was great, but I wouldn't really expect him to get 50 yards on 5 targets every single week. A little bit of hesitation going forward for Tyler Conklin, but have to see him do bad first before we can write off what we've gotten from him so far this year. Then Dawson Knox brought him way up, as you can see, quite far down in the projections, and that makes enough sense. But I still like that ceiling, especially at my tight end position. Go for it all or give me nothing. I don't care if I lose by 5 points to somebody else's tight end, as long as you're not facing a Mark Andrews or a Travis Kelce, in which case I still want that ceiling. For the most part, I don't I'm not aiming for floors. Just sometimes in the case of a Darren Waller, I'll take the floor over Tyler Conklin, but there's more to it than just the floor there. So Dawson Knox, still loving that ceiling potential from him in this matchup against Pittsburgh. It should be a good matchup, has been so far for teams against that passing defense of Pitt. And Logan Thomas, I think he might have moved up a couple slots here, or maybe he ends up around the same spot there, so just still liking that ceiling. This is a good week for Washington to return to what we saw those first 2 weeks. Maybe not as, it's not the same matchup as a Detroit is. Wouldn't quite expect that amount of scoring, but there should be enough movement of the ball to have a few good fantasy producers this week. And then Evan Ingram suffered a little bit last week, but as you can see, red hot matchup here again, going up against Houston. I pretty much agree with a lot of this, but I'm just expecting him to actually have one of these, a higher game than this expected range, and to get, 10-ish points maybe. I think that's very, very possible this week, and a touchdown is very, very possible, which would probably shoot him up higher than 16. Then Hunter Henry with Jonnu Smith out. We're liking that just a little bit more this week, and I'm willing to bet on that to a certain extent over a few guys, obviously, even over Dalton Schultz. Now, maybe not. Dalton Schultz actually has had some very, very good usage as far as his snap share, routes run go on the team. Just hasn't quite gotten the ball, and it's just really not a great matchup there against the Rams. They do pretty darn good against the tight ends, but it still has a floor that I am somewhat comfortable with, especially given how involved he is on the offense, even if that hasn't quite turned out for fantasy so far this season. Will Dissly, I can't sit there and buy what he's done, but I did tell you after week 1 that I felt that he might be the best match at tight end for Geno Smith, because he's not like Noah Fant, who's just going to go out and, is it Noah? Yeah, Noah Fant, who is just going to go out and run routes. He's going to block, and then he's going to release from his block, and then he's going to go and find an open hole in the defense and be forgotten about by the time that Geno Smith's throwing to him, because Geno Smith ends up holding onto that ball a fair bit, has to move around. That offensive line's much better at run blocking than they are pass blocking. And so things just break down a little bit, and that's where Will Dissly is taking advantage of things. And then K. Dotton, like I said, he didn't end up going up as high as I thought he would with some increased stats. But, if Cameron Brate is out, I would take that risk over these other guys. Obviously, that's why I have him ranked there, and I intend to keep him ranked above several. Mo Alley Cox, still not buying it, but that's okay if you are. I won't argue too much. He's had some pretty good usage, especially that's where, once I got down to around this area, looked at the usage statistics, and just kind of went from there for the opportunity. And that's where Robert Tanyan wasn't able to put him up higher. I was kind of about to, and then as I was looking at the amount of snaps that these guys are getting on the field, didn't really love that. And then I did move Isaiah Likely up over Cole Kmet and Gesicki, despite them having good matchups, and they do have decent matchups here going up against Minnesota and the New York Jets. For Cole Kmet, things are turning around. So I ended up putting Isaiah Likely up there as just a statement that I would rather take the risk of Isaiah Likely becoming a bigger part of this offense. If this is only if Bateman is out for this week. If Rashad Bateman's playing, then ignore this. But if Rashad Bateman's out, I do think that there will be an increase in usage for Isaiah Likely as much as anybody else. Unless they are just able to run the ball all day, which is, I guess, possible. Well, who are we playing? Cincinnati. Maybe. And then Cole Kmet, I moved up ahead of Gesicki one spot there compared to the projections, just because Cole Kmet's on the field way, way more than Mike Gesicki. So that is it. Time to record the quarterbacks, and then done for the day for the rankings videos. So thank you very much. once again, up on the website. All of this will be not until Thursday, Friday, whenever I get a decent chance.